Hello, lovely listener, and welcome to the Aardvark Swift podcast. I'm Jimmy Bowers, and I'm part of the marketing team here at Aardvark Swift. Throughout this series, we'll be chatting to game studios, initiatives, and industry professionals about all things video games, from tips on how to get into this line of work, to studio cultures and projects to get involved in. This month, I spoke to Rick Gibson of the BGI, Declan Cassidy of Into Games, and Andy Driver of Grads in Games about the first annual Games Careers Week. We discussed the need to better map out industry employment pathways, ensuring the future of game development is more diverse, and the importance of speaking directly to the general public about the valuable and lifelong careers on offer in the industry. What do you do, and sort of who are you representing within Games Careers Week?
Sure. So my name's Rick Gibson. I'm the chief exec of the BGI, which is a games education charity that we set up nearly 2 years ago. But that was the result of a long-running campaign with nearly 600 game studios and universities to create a new agency for games culture and education in the UK. My background is that I've been in games for over 20 years, mostly as a consultant, advising over 110 different games companies, finance companies, big media companies on how to engage with games and how to make money out of them. But I've also got quite a long history of campaigning. So I came up with the idea of games tax relief. And when I pitched it to government, they decided it wasn't such a good idea, and I didn't take it lying down. So I got about 30 of the biggest studios and both trade bodies to fund a campaign to educate the public about the value of games, the economic value and the cultural value of games. And we campaigned for 4 years doing all the economic analysis, etc., about why games are good and why they need support. And we won that 4 years later. And happy to say that tax relief has now paid out over £500 million to British games companies. The other bit of campaigning is, of course, setting up this charity. And we run the National Video Games Museum. We run the Games Education Summit, and delighted to be one of the co-founders of Games Careers Week.
Doing the Lord's work, trying to lobby government.
It's a long, slow process, and it actually comes down to preparing the ground and then getting your timing right. There's something about Games Careers Week and the timing of this that I'm sure we'll talk about later that feels really well timed.
Definitely. And same question to you, Declan.
Yes, so my name's Declan Cassidy. I'm the CEO of Into Games, and we kind of started roughly at the same time as the BGI, I think, just over 2 years ago. So there was obviously something in the water around that time, because it felt like there was some kind of shift that was happening, maybe around studios realizing that they need to maybe do more around connecting with education and building that pipeline. You know, my background is pretty squiggly, I suppose. So I actually originally started out in kind of community events and festivals a long time ago, and lots of kind of grassroots work with educational institutions and young people to kind of build up their confidence through events and live music production. Kind of moved on to running an arts venue for about 4 years, which we kind of ran about 250 shows a year. Lots of late nights. Definitely happy to be not doing events anymore, especially in the current climate. Pretty difficult work. And then I moved on to setting up a company called Maker Club, which I kind of partnered up with an electronic engineer, and we set up an organization that taught young people design and engineering skills. So we kind of built hardware, created a curricula around kind of design and invention, and then set up 100 kind of maker spaces across the country. So in libraries, secondary schools, primary schools, filled those things with 3D printers and all kinds of mad creative live briefs, and had a really, really kind of wonderful time, I guess, understanding the kind of technology sector at that point, certainly the diversity problems within that more widely. So when the opportunity came to work in games, which was actually a little side project. So I was working with a woman called Kirsty Rigdon, who's the co-founder of Into Games. She's the director of a games company down here in Brighton called Future Lab. And she educated me, I guess, around the diversity problems that the game sector faced. And obviously it was very similar to what was in other kind of tech industries at the time and continues to be. So we ran a very small project where we got a bunch of kids on free school meals together and connected them to a bunch of studios in Brighton. They spent 2 weeks building games, understanding what the sector looked like. And, we had 15 kids that kind of came into that process, of course, loving to play games. But, by the end of it, they were all talking about how they wanted to be audio engineers or, UI experts or, kind of level designers. And it was just some fantastic to see. And from my side, it really opened my eyes up to the power of games to inspire careers like that. But then also how amazing the industry and industry staff had been around that, and their real desire to want to work with young people in a really solid and powerful way. And it was so inspiring to me and to understand that sector a little bit more that I just had to work in it. That was over 2 years ago now. And we set up Into Games initially with the very broad mission of making the industry more diverse around careers and around kind of career accessibility. And then we went about creating some ideas for program work initially by traveling around to the different clusters around the UK and bringing together educators, learners, and studios to understand where the gaps were and what the landscape looked like. And then we got together to create the kind of program work that we're doing today. So Into Games now has the largest collection of careers, information, and educational pathways to careers in the games industry available kind of pretty much anywhere online. So we've got 130 different careers mapped on intogames.org. And then we run the Video Games Ambassador Network with Yuki. So we connect up to 25 opportunities a month to industry professionals directly into education. So that's between 3,000 to 10,000 young people are kind of being positively affected by that work. And then we run stuff like kind of virtual work experience and our digital mentorship program, which connects 250 industry staff directly to those just over 16. So there's no upper limit on that. Various bits and pieces. And we're obviously very proud to be now doing this work with this, wonderful crew around kind of Games Careers Week and pushing that forward.
Definitely. I mean, I know you do quite a lot of important work. It's kind of like demystifying the industry, making sort of career paths accessible and visible as well. 'Cause I mean, I went to high school probably just over a decade ago. Didn't really get a lot of employment information for different industries. Had no idea what kind of career paths there were. Ended up going into a career path I didn't enjoy for quite a while. But yeah, I kind of always wanted to aim towards games, but leaving education with no information as to how that would be achievable, people just kind of write it off.
I mean, that's the thing, understanding that this starts young and isn't something you can just kind of jump into. That's understanding the whole pipeline. So working from primary through to secondary and then building up from there. And I think actually, you mentioned kind of careers advice there, and that's kind of beginning to become quite an important part of our work, is bringing together those careers advisors and letting them know about the broad variety of careers that are on offer in the games industry, which is underlyingly the core of what Games Careers Week is about. So, that network of careers advisors now stands at about 300, I think we've got now. We provide them with regular CPD and regular information and updates about the game sector and the opportunities in it that they can pass to their students at secondary school, who are then deciding what A levels to take and where their journey into games might take them, and also just how hard it is. I think that's important because that is the thing. It's like one thing to say anyone should have the opportunity to get into games, and of course that's what we believe in, that's what we all believe in. But then also it's another thing to say that anyone can get a job in games, because you can't. It's very, very difficult. It's a really, really hard sector to crack, and you need to be the best you can possibly be in your specific area. And that's a kind of hard line for us all to walk, because of course we want it to be accessible to everyone, but at the same time, there needs to be some element of reality around that. So it's kind of, how do we do that?
No, definitely. So last but not least, Andy, would you like to introduce yourself?
My name is Andy Driver. I'm the operations manager at Grads in Games. Grads in Games was launched 11 years ago now by Aardvark Swift. We were backed by Aardvark Swift as a commercial entity. However, this year we are changing. We are now becoming backed by a not-for-profit organisation, a community interest company, which is really exciting. My personal background is in recruitment. So I've been in recruitment for 7 years now, primarily within the tech space. So really been on the front lines, dealing with candidates and employers and doling out lots of careers advice before I sort of started this job. But what Grads in Games does is we aim to help students become more employable for the games industry. So originally, 11 years ago, there was a big disconnect between, actually what people were being taught at university and college and actually what the industry needs and the kind of skills that they need. And Grads in Games was formed to try and address that. So every year we work with thousands upon thousands of students, and we try and help them kind of get ready for a career in games. So this is kind of the next step on, I suppose, from what Declan does, showing them that the opportunities are there, showing them the pathways to get towards it. What we do is kind of the finishing touches as such. So we go around, we visit universities, we deliver careers talks, we deliver really practical advice on, actually how to structure your CV, what kind of things you should have in it, what you shouldn't, how you should structure your portfolio for different types of roles, what kind of things you need to be including on that. We also then provide opportunities for students to be able to build something for their portfolio through Search for a Star, which is our flagship initiative, if you will, where we work with industry to provide students a brief on a project that they can then make and they can then use for their portfolio. Everything we do tries to bring the industry and academia closer together and try and improve those links. So everything we do is backed by studios, by industry. They work with us and partner with us on all the stuff that we do, so that the advice and the guidance we give to students is, exactly the kind of things that they would want people to know. Games Careers Week falls exactly into, what we're trying to do and trying to bring everybody together, bringing academia, bringing all the teachers, the students, bringing them alongside the industry that's there already, opening up opportunities, opening up more collaboration, and then hopefully, inspiring others who are outside of all of that, who haven't quite got that far yet, to want to take part.
Yeah, definitely. I think all sort of three of your initiatives together and Games Career Week creates quite a strong pipeline for people to follow through, sort of step by step, which kind of brings us quite nicely to a broad question, but kind of the crux of the conversation. So what is Games Careers Week and who is it for?
I can maybe have a stab at that. So, one of the things you'll notice from the organisations around the table today is that we all work in collaboration with industry, and we bring educators and industry to the table in order to help improve the experience for the learners, but also improve the quality of people coming into the industry, and particularly the diversity of people coming into the industry. And I think that when we first started talking about this initiative, one of the key realizations that we had was that no one organisation, no matter how big or small, has a kind of monopoly and can deliver every step of that pathway that a young person might take eventually into a career in games, or maybe an older person might take to restart a career in games or transfer into a career in games. We don't have any large enough programs that cover every single base. And instead what we have is we have this sort of patchwork quilt of amazing programs that each do their own thing in their own part of that pathway. And so I think as collaborative organizations that are used to working with lots of others, it just made so much sense for us to be talking about bringing together our programs and focusing it on a single time of the year in order to not just showcase all the things that we do, but to welcome lots of other organizations that are doing similar things. So that's on the industry side, but the most important person in this equation is the person on the pathway. So it's actually about the recipient. And we as an industry are good at talking to each other, and we can get into the jargon of our sort of work, but we've got to talk to the public in order to change some of the really deep rooted challenges that exist in the sector and more widely. And I boiled those down to sort of two key elements. One is that the public, and particularly diverse members of the public, don't understand that there are exciting, lifelong, very well paid, challenging careers in games that are in the UK, and that there are over 25,000 who make games professionally. That is just not understood. In fact, I mean, what we see in the museum every day is that people don't really have an appreciation that people make games in the first place, let alone that we've got one of the biggest and the most profitable games industries in the world in the UK, and one of the oldest, right, over 40 years. The public don't really have an appreciation of games as a career. And so we've got to talk to the public in a way that isn't about how we talk to our sector, internally to the sector. We've got to demystify, we've got to showcase, we've got to role model those diverse career pathways that anybody from any background can pick up if they've got the passion and the momentum, but also the information that they need. And at risk of banging on a bit more, I suppose the other important thing to say is that although the industry has been making strides in terms of becoming more diverse, we are nowhere near as diverse as either our players or our population. And for me, that is a massive commercial opportunity for the games industry in this country, because if you make your teams, the teams that are making games, if they get more diverse, then they start to match the audiences that play our games. And therefore, that's something that will generate more income for our games companies. But to do that and to change the perceptions of both the public and also the diversity in our workforce, as Declan says, you need to get to people young. Start to showcase those careers. You need to start to nudge parents gently in the direction of making choices at GCSE and at A-level, and showing that there are multiple different ways into this industry.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. I think the influence not just on people that are already very familiar with the games industry, but the people that are sort of external to that, if you like parents and carers and that sort of thing. I do completely agree that there's not a understanding, might be a wrong word, but there's not an appreciation for the sort of career paths that we, all four of us, know that exist. It takes kind of a lot of self-discovery for the individual, for the particular child that's going through this process, to do a lot of the legwork themselves. Obviously, that's improved over the years, but yeah, I think outside of our own bubble, yeah, it's getting a bit more of a word out there of what's on offer, really.
I think one of the key things that Rick said right at the start is that we realise that, yeah, we all do amazing programs, and there's loads of amazing programs done by organisations outside of us three as well. The whole industry gets involved in doing this. However, individually, we can only do so much. And I think as we began talks about a potential Games Careers Week, we kind of came to the realisation that if we try and get everyone to work together, and if everybody pulls together, we can try and address some of those bigger issues in the industry rather than kind of doing little bits. And it's that collaborative nature of bringing everybody together to showcase the amazing stuff that goes on, but then also hopefully to inspire others to want to do amazing stuff, and then inspire the public and say, look, it's something that's worthwhile looking into. It's just as valuable as, you know, going to become a lawyer or a doctor. You can make a proper career of this, and it's inspiring those people to then want to pursue it and seek out the information that is already out there to figure out how they do that.
I think it's also the right time to do this. I guess the narrative, certainly the media narrative around games for a long time has been, I could say that it's been kind of overwhelmingly negative, pretty much. You know, I think it's hard to disagree with that. But the current situation that we've been facing all together for the last year and trying to pull through together, and I think has really shown the positivity around games, you know, and there's been a real shift in how games is talked about in the media and how games are then perceived by parents, you know, not so much as these things that will melt your child's brain, but you know, more that they are these essential social spaces, these ways of, you know, kind of coming together at times like this, you know. And I think that there's a moment now in between all of this to kind of really showcase games as they should be. And there's a moment in these kind of parents' brains where they're like, oh, actually, maybe a career in games is a positive way forward.
I think the timing also, if you tie that into where we are in the world in the middle of a pandemic, with possibly an end in sight, but the politicians right now not saying, right, everybody, you can loosen up and get back to the world, where we've had multiple industries in complete crisis. And I run a museum, and I can tell you it's not been a fun year. But I can also say that we've been running the workshops for schools that we ran before in person in galleries, where we'd have thousands of kids and schools coming in to play games and learn how they're made. We've also seen a huge appetite from parents and from families looking for information, and actually proud to say we won an award actually for our workshops online during the pandemic. So there's a lot of appetite out there. And if you then look at collapsing industries, lots of talk about industries needing to transfer, our population needing to retrain. And then you look at the game sector, which has grown. I mean, last year, the annualized growth of the game sector by workforce, just the development sector, was 12.2%. You look at other industries and they were contracting. Thousands and thousands, more than that, I would imagine, of people losing their jobs, whereas games is growing. It's 2,500 jobs were added in the 15 months to November of last year by our games companies. So, I mean, rampant growth in the middle of a pandemic from an industry that was incredibly agile in terms of moving to home working. And of course, benefited from a massive boost in sales as well, which saw, games kind of rise even further above all of the other media in the country. I mean, there's definitely a timing issue there, because if we go to policymakers, we go to the media, in the midst of all of this doom and gloom and complete havoc in families, particularly those from disadvantaged communities, we think that going to the public with a good news story about an industry that has been growing at record levels and that wants to welcome more diverse candidates and is willing to open its doors to show UK people how games are made and how they might pursue careers. I think that's a really, really good news story.
Definitely. I think this is, of course, it's about games careers, but it's also about game skills. The way that those skills can be applied to other industries. There are a lot of jobs in games, but there are a limited amount of jobs in games and lots of people that want to get into games. But it's the underlying game skills that are so powerful cross industry. So, you can use the skills that you develop, when you're developing games in a whole bunch of different ways, from kind of architecture, for medicine, for all kinds of different sectors are now using those skills in different applications, so certainly as Games Careers Week grows, I think we're going to be talking more about that skills narrative as well.
Interesting, going back to mentioning the sort of historically negative connotations that games had. I mean, it's definitely more mainstream than it's ever been, but as you say, Declan, there's some way to go. I mean, that's definitely the experience growing up. As much as I love my parents, definitely the experience I had, because although that kind of thought was thereof, I definitely know that's the industry I want to work in. The employment advice I was given was you need to learn a trade. So yeah, definitely learning these skills and getting this advice early on will make a big difference, I think.
I was going to actually maybe just push back on that ever so slightly. I think 10, 15 years ago, the idea that you'd have a positive story about video games and the video games development industry in most of the mainstream media, it was extremely unlikely that you would see that. And what we found with the Games Up campaign, which is PR'd by some of the same people who are PRing the Games Careers Week festival, is that actually the media are increasingly receptive to stories about games from the positive side. And let's not forget that, we've got, the industry is 45 years old, but they've also had academics looking at the positive beneficial impact of games and playing games and socializing in games and all of the skills that you generate just by playing for almost the same amount of time. But the other thing I would say, just to sort of push back, because I'm not sure it is overwhelmingly negative, I think that there has been a generational shift, and we see this a lot, and this is one of the reasons why we founded the charity, and the museum's much older than that, but is that generational shift has been going on in the media. It's been going on across the country with the stakeholders, with politicians. And, we've had prime ministers openly saying that they play games, not ashamed to say that they might have done it when they were a teenager, but they've grown out of that now, which you might have expected maybe 20 years ago. But I think 10 years ago, we all play. And so I think there's a cultural confidence. I would sort of push back on ideas that games are always maligned in the press. I don't think they are the whole time. But I think that what happens is that it's a very familiar path. And I think that the media do slip very easily into games are bad, loot boxes, gambling, addiction, all of those tropes that you do get in the media. I think they easily slip back into that, despite the fact that they know that games are not detrimental. In fact, they're very beneficial.
No, yeah, I totally agree. So as Games Careers Week then, what was the initial concept and how has it evolved into what it's sort of becoming now?
I don't want to answer that immediately because actually we were a little bit downstream from the initial ideas that came out from Grads and Games and almost a week later from Into Games around having a wider public event. So guys...
So from our point of view, the initial idea was, well, we run events at a certain time of year and you guys run events at a certain time of year, and they're all roughly around the same time of year usually, and they all roughly have similar audiences, maybe not exactly, but roughly similar audiences. And the initial idea was, well, rather than competing, why don't we work together, cross-promote, collaborate, and maybe we can all benefit from it. And I think that was the initial kind of nugget of an idea. And then it's kind of snowballed from there into maybe rather than just doing that, we could now involve lots of people. We can involve lots of organizations. We can involve the whole industry. And then when you start thinking about that, you can then go, well, actually, rather than just kind of cross-promoting and helping us reach more people in the industry, now we can now start to think, well, maybe we can start to influence some of those bigger issues outside of the industry, which we've talked about. it's probably snowballed from an initial idea of, we can cross promote, I'll help you, you help me, that kind of thing, into actually maybe we can influence change if we all work together. I think the key thing is the collaboration thing and working together and inspiring others to work together rather than trying to compete against each other.
And I think, certainly from Into Games side, we sit over the Video Games Ambassador Network, and we were seeing so many of these grassroots events happening all over the country, whether it was a small college or a secondary school bringing in a game speaker, or a little kind of game jam that was happening on this side of the country or whatever. So it felt like, certainly with the Video Games Ambassador platform as well, there was a tool there to be able to connect industry to education. Sometimes you need like a point in the year to just kind of filter everybody to kind of get that impetus going. And additionally, we've got all this great careers information on our website, but the most important thing is like, how do you get to that careers information? What is the real world push to get eyes on that information and then kind of bring people onto that pathway? And it felt like a kind of single event that brought together all the initiatives to act as something that could, shout about the work that they're doing, act as a gateway to new work, act as a platform to raise everybody up. Felt like a really important thing for us to do. And I think, I'm definitely not comparing this to pyramids, but different cultures all over the world kind of at the same time developed the kind of technology and ideas, without really chatting to each other. In a weird way, we were a week apart, weren't we, Andy, in terms of coming up with that idea of let's do a Careers Games Week. We hadn't spoken about that at all. I think just there's something around at the time that kind of brought us together. Maybe it is the pyramids. Why not? Pyramids.
Really nicely timed from the BGI's point of view, because in 2019, when we ran the first Games Ed Summit, where we brought all the leading games educators into the same room as a bunch of really big studios to talk about games careers, games recruitment, games education, and had a really quite fiery debate about what each side of that coin requires from the other, and how neither side was really providing what the other needed. One of the ideas that we tabled back then was the idea of tackling this signposting problem. I want to talk about that a bit because it's something that I reflect on a lot, and as we build Games Careers Week out, it's something that I'm very keen to do. With all of these different programs that are available online and in person and in schools and universities, in our museum and widely across the sector, what will tend to happen if you're a recipient, so if you are the parent of, a 15-year-old, you might find out about one of these many programs. You might get your child to go and take that. And then what do you do next? And it's not that the programs don't exist, it's that they're not linked up. So the signposting is broken. When you go into our Pixel Heads After School Club at the National Video Game Museum, where you can come and learn gently as an 8 or a 10 or a 12-year-old about how games are made and what they mean. Do we signpost on to, an Into Games school or a Next Gen Skills Academy or a digital schoolhouse? Well, we don't. And from those schemes, do they signpost on to Screen Skills or Tiger accredited universities? And from those universities, do they signpost on to all of the careers material that, for instance, Into or Grads in Games provide, or the How to Start Your Career in Video Games course that we run on the Future Learn platform? Mm-hmm. And the answer is kind of no. And it's a sort of no-brainer to say, oh, well, we all need to hook up. And we're trying to do that. But doing that organically is really hard. That's the internal industry view. But for the user, what that means is that that parent of that 15-year-old can do one course and then get stuck, not know where to go next because of that signposting. So what the BGI has been talking about for 2 years, but finally decided to fund in the middle of last year, was a website that would channel interest from anyone, an educator, a parent, a really young person interested in games, through to somebody choosing their A-levels or a university or wanting to start a career. We would gather that interest and start to channel it out to not just BGI programs, but all the other wonderful programs that are out there. And so just as Andy and Declan were calling up to say, should we do something at this time of year? We had just allocated that funding. So it just was perfect timing for us to pull together this sort of pan-industry campaign. I just wanted to sort of say that I've just had a look at the number of people that have signed up to support this with events. yesterday evening went over 70. And those are on top of the 36 partners that we had before we ran the town hall last week. So there is the possibility that there might be over 100 organisations across the sector, and we're talking about not just third sector organisations, the biggest studios in the country, some really small ones, a whole load of schools, a whole load of universities, all saying, we want to run events. And I think that's really exciting. I think that's a really big win for this initiative. But what we've got to do is we've got to translate that into a whole host of events for the public to enjoy. And that's the challenge for the next 6 to 8 weeks.
Definitely sounds like a mammoth undertaking, from the sort of initial concepts that make sense to actually pulling it together practically. So, I mean, hats off to you all. But how would a studio, a publisher, an educational institution, a charity, if they're wanting to get involved in Games Careers Week, how would they go about doing that?
We're asking for people to sign up to say, that sounds like a good idea. I'd potentially like to run an event, through the expression of interest form that we'll make available to everyone. You can sign up directly from the gamescareersweek.org website. And that's simply a stake in the ground to say, this sounds like a program I'd like to support. Don't yet know how, but please send me more information. So what we're going to be doing over the space of the next month is announcing the first raft of events from the steering group, which includes Yuki and Tiger and the Next Gen Skills Academy, as well as gamesindustry.biz. But in a month or so, we will open up a site where people can start to submit their events and tell us, what it is, who's running it, who's it for, where it's running, and links through to web pages where the public can sign up to join the event.
So obviously the hopes for Games Careers Week is to, not only make games careers more visible to people outside of the industry, to make the pathways a lot more clear, make the actual roles a lot more accessible. But have you got any sort of other hopes for the event that should come off the back of this?
If I can just pick that one up, I'm going to give props to Declan here, because when we were having our probably second or third stage of talks about what this would be, the realization that this wasn't just a sort of an industry thing, this was actually about talking to the public, was really critical. And Declan's intervention was to say, well, we're all going to put a little bit of money into this to fund it from our non-profit organisations. But really, if we're going to spend that money, are we spending that money on a producer who can pull it all together? Or are we saying, actually, we need to reach the public? What that budget has gone towards, apart from the investment that the organisations are putting into each of our own events during the week, is that budget has gone to a PR company called Shift 6. And Shift 6 is a PR company that's used to talking to the mainstream media. We've kind of deliberately not gone to PR companies that the industry knows and loves. We wanted to talk to the mainstream media outlets that are forming opinions for the public, for those parents, and talk to them in a really different way than we would talk to industry. And so we've got some really exciting ideas that have come out of that partnership, which is in part funded by a foundation that the media company that Shift 6 has set up to increase inclusion and diversity online. So there's a really nice meeting of minds there in terms of our diversity goals and theirs. We're trying to change the public perception of what a career in games development looks like through one of the key ways that we all interpret information, which is visually. If you do a web search on Google Images for games developer, in fact, if you just do a Google search for that, at the top you'll see a whole load of pictures, and those pictures are almost exclusively white and male. And so that is one of those points of friction where a person of color or a female, or maybe somebody with a disability or other indicators of diversity might not see themselves in that search and then think, that's not for me. They might carry on looking, but there'll be that little doubt, that seed of doubt will be planted at the back of their minds that if I haven't seen someone like me doing games development, then maybe there isn't a career for someone like me. And so we're going to try and change the visual narrative by creating an image library of diverse games developers that we can basically kind of commandeer Google, so that when somebody puts games developer into a search, they see a nice diverse range of developers in the kind of workforce that we all want to develop. That's just one example of a number of media campaigns that we're going to be running in the run-up to the week.
I think in terms of our ambitions for Games Careers Week as well. This is the first year we kind of talked about this approaching December, pulled this together, very, very quickly. This will be the shortest time ever to organize a Games Careers Week. From this point onward,
so.
Obviously from next year it'll be a good year, so we can do a lot more. But I remember when we were talking, the three of us initially, and I think that there's a real kind of ambition around wanting Games Careers Week to maybe help fund further work, so becoming a kind of a force in its own right. So like any major festival, I guess, you get those festivals that commission work for that event every year. And I think, as we progress forward, it'd be fantastic if Games Careers Week could become one of those kind of vehicles, so that we could fund small grassroots projects across the country that showcased excellence in games careers education. We became a real advocate for that. So I'm hoping that we can work after this one, once we've got this over and done with, and have some real fantastic stats to talk about, that we can kind of progress that and see where that goes after this.
Totally agree, and I love